Hello Popcorn Junkies, and welcome to this review of Blitz, the brand new film by Steve McQueen. There's a whole generation out there of film lovers and not film lovers who, when I say Steve McQueen, are thinking of blue-eyed Steve McQueen, but I don't mean that Steve McQueen. I mean the director, the artist, the art house director, the producer, the guy who gave us things like 12 Years a Slave and Hunger and Shame and the remake of Widows and such like, and Small Axe. A very, very talented, very meaningful, very rigorous filmmaker who's kind of dovetailed between art house, indie, and then sort of has yanked himself back to sort of mainstream. I'd say things like Widows was much more mainstream, and I have to say, not as successful for me as a film as, say, something like Hunger was, or Shame was, or certainly 12 Years a Slave was. Very traumatic, very intense, and has that thing that he is an artist by trade too, a video artist. He has moments in his films where he really sort of visually allows things to breathe and for us to kind of operate on an almost non-filmic level, just pictorial. So he's a very talented filmmaker, very talented artist. But this is Blitz, which even the title and even the kind of subject matter feels sort of almost petrifyingly straightforward for a director such as Steve McQueen. It stars Saoirse Ronan. It's set within the Blitz of World War II, which is obviously when the German Luftwaffe committed or conducted the Blitzkrieg, which was a sort of rampaging assault, which I think lasted up to or nearly a year, bombing huge parts of industrial Britain and obviously hitting London principally. So it's called Blitz, and it's set within World War II, and we're following Saoirse Ronan, who is a single mum. She's a single mum who lives at home with her dad, played by Paul Weller. I spent at least 5 minutes in the film sort of thinking, is that Paul Weller, really? But then, of course, he played the old Joanna, and he had a few pearls of wisdom, all shout, no trousers, all that kind of stuff. And I thought, yeah, that's Paul Weller. So Saoirse Ronan, Paul Weller, a newcomer in the form of the young boy who plays her son, Elliot, Heffernan, who I want to give a particular shout out. This is his screen debut, and I'm going to talk about some of the kind of, he didn't have many lines of dialogue, but he had to emote, he had to respond, and he had to walk through history, essentially. And obviously the kind of the twist, if you like, or the alternate take or aspect that this film takes in regards to World War II and the Blitz is the fact that Saoirse Ronan's son, George, is black. He's mixed race. She's had a brief liaison, you could say, with his father, and this son emerged, and you can sort of, so it's kind of unusual. I mean, what is quite challenging in a good way about this film is how all of the kind of usual iconography and all of the kind of usual things about the child evacuations of World War II. Nadia's mum was an evacuee. My old friend and father figure, if you like, Jim, he was a World War II evacuee, and you hear about this and you've seen it in films like the great, what's the Railway Children, is that about evacuees? But you've seen it, we've seen them in so many films. And of course, within this, you've got things like bombing, you've got explosions, you've got firemen, you've got the Blitz, you've got underground, the London Underground, people going down there into bunkers. But parked within the middle of it all is a black boy, and you think, my God, this is different. This is different. I'd never even entertained the thought that you would even really have had people of colour even in London. I do think we tend to think sometimes that there was a sort of cut-off point that the 50s or certainly the 60s, whereby the Windrush generation came through, and so the cultural diversity of the UK changed. But this is part that much earlier. This is in World War II, and so we are following a boy who Saoirse Ronan is forced to evacuate. He doesn't forgive her. He gets on the train. He doesn't look at her. She's in pieces. He heads off to the countryside. She has to go back to working in a munitions factory. All the classic kind of, iconography, all the classic kind of scenes and settings and all that kind of stuff. Paul Weller is still playing the piano in their tiny house back at home. And he goes and he's evacuated, but he's bullied. He's bullied on the train, and he goes AWOL. He throws himself off the train. And this boy is great, Elliot Heffernan, played by Elliot Heffernan. He moves through this entire film pretty much looking at all other kids, which is mainly at the beginning, because he jumps off the train and essentially makes his way back to London. There's a little bit of sort of almost Dick Whittington, is it Dick Whittington? Whichever one makes his way back to town. He tries to find his way back towards his mum. He's heading home, and that's really the narrative arc of the film, is the young boy, George, goes missing. his journey back. Saoirse Ronan is told that he's gone missing by the department that looks after evacuating kids. She's beside herself, and meanwhile it's like all of his adventures, if you like, en route. That's all well and good. That's all well and good. It's a simple premise, simply told. And, you know, it's an opportunity to really kind of indulge in some big set pieces. You know, there's like the BBC arrives at Saoirse Ronan's munitions factory for a sort of talent contest almost. And she's the singer, and you've got the great big mics, and you've got all the kind of BBC voices and all that kind of stuff. And you've got all the girls, all, you know, salt the earth girls kind of building the bombs and all that kind of stuff. I think quite quickly, though, I began to feel something just began to kind of turn for me. So I was settling in, and it started actually with quite impressionistic, sort of clearly artificially created sort of, or poetically kind of imagined bombs falling from the sky. They were almost too clean. It was kind of poetic, it was artistic. And then we had this black and white, almost an infrared heat camera of dandelions or flowers. I have to say, incredibly reminiscent of The Zone of Interest, the Jonathan Glazer movie about Auschwitz, in which a similar technique or device was used for poppies, I think it was. And so I thought, that's not particularly, I did feel this kind of weird thing where I thought, that's a bit not original, it's kind of already been done. But anyway, so there were little sort of flurries of kind of artistry right at the front. But this film kind of locked into, and I think this is ultimately the criticism I have of it, it locked into a pretty predictable, pretty pedestrian actually, very unlayered, unsophisticated, uncomplicated piece of storytelling. And its mission, I guess, was to tell us that, look, what we know of World War II, or what we know of an event like the Blitz, yeah, we have our understanding of it through our white privilege and through our white eyes and perspective on things. But this film is going to offer us something else. But I think, and okay, it's kind of possibly easy for me as a white man watching this film to say this, I don't necessarily feel by the end this film had particularly told me anything, not that I necessarily didn't know, but that I wouldn't have surmised or assumed would have been the experience of a young black boy passing through war-torn, wartime Britain during the bombing. So there were no real surprises for me, except for one, and I'll talk about that one in a minute. The portrayal of the Blitz, you know, the scene setting, all the kind of tenement blocks, all the kind of, you know, terraced houses, the bombing. I think one of the interesting things one has to remember about the Blitz, albeit, of course, it was terrorising and it was awful, the total number of casualties in the Blitz of World War II was no more than 43,000. Now, that's a lot, obviously. But something struck me watching this as I watched scene after scene of devastation and debris and buildings falling down and people dying and people being pulled from the rubble and people, you know, really quite stressful scenes of all of the civilians like struggling, smashing at the gates, trying to get through, trying to get down onto the Stepney Green kind of platforms and all that kind of stuff. You know, it was very well covered. It was very, very kind of period accurate. You know, you felt you were immersed, you felt you were in there. London was a burning furnace of hell and all that kind of stuff. But everything that was happening to our young boy George as he moved through it, and really everything that was happening to Saoirse Ronan in her sort of sadness and her kind of depression and her kind of fear and worry around, certainly when she found out that her son had gone missing and it was AWOL essentially, none of it kind of rang. Did it ring true? It wasn't particularly complicated. There was no real subtext to anything. It felt like Saoirse Ronan was merely a woman who would be stressed about where her son was, but there was little else for her to be stressed about. I mean, she went out on a couple of dates with her mates from the munitions factory. There's a bit of flirtation. She has a bit of a thing almost going on with Harris Dickinson. He has a tiny role in it. He's always great, isn't he? He's always a very sort of strong anchoring presence. We had a flashback, which for me was one of the most surprising things, where we kind of flashed back to a scene in which she either met or was dancing with the father of George, and it was a principally, you know, West Indian, black, sort of undercover, if you like, kind of place to sort of dance and play music and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, oh wow, I wonder if these kind of things were actually going on. Isn't that fascinating to think that there was this black subculture going on in Britain, in London, in the 1940s, in World War II? This is astonishing. So that, you know, so that was eye-opening. But I found the rest of it quite toe-curlingly cliche written. I found the boy's kind of connection with a kind of wandering sort of military police officer who was also black and from Nigeria. I found that connection was a bit, it could have been really nice. I thought it was beautifully played by the actor who played the military policeman. But it was a bit, the writing, the script writing, it was a bit twee, it was a bit saccharine. It was a bit rich. And then really perhaps the most interesting part of this film, which is also possibly the least effective, and yet at the same time, even though it was the least effective and the most sort of, I don't know, intensely cliche ridden, it also weirdly becomes one of the standout moments in the film. And this is Stephen Graham and Kathy Burke playing a pair of really nasty underworld individuals. Him, a sort of war veteran, I presume from World War I, who has sort of strange psychopathic, sociopathic rages from, I presume, sort of shrapnel. He's like literally been dumbstruck by the sounds and the trauma of artillery fire and what have you. Anyway, he's a lunatic, but he's like Fagin. And then Kathy Burke is this absolutely petrifying woman who, the only parallel I could draw with her was she was just like the villainess in the Goonies. And the two of them become this strange Oliver Twisty kind of Fagin sort of stooges who kind of lead and use George to kind of get into small places and nick things and find things and rob things from derelict buildings. I suppose in a weird way, even the thought that sort of a dark, a black market of illegality and law breaking was happening, looting and all that kind of stuff. We don't think of those things, do we? We sort of have a romantic image of what happened in World War II. That's why I think films like Wish You Were Here were so good in puncturing the myth of a sort of idyllic 1950s Britain. Actually, it was full of seedy, not full of, but there were seedy men there like then, like there were seedy men now. And even the kind of backstory that we were given about Saoirse Ronan's partner, the father of George, it was a bit predictable. You see him kind of get into a fracas with some kind of white idiots on the street. Then a couple of police officers come along and manhandle him. And then he's taken off into the night and he disappears. And you think, I'm pretty sure that's how it would have happened, absolutely. But it was kind of done in such a sort of unsurprising or unoriginal way that you kind of just, everything kind of just ended up kind of slightly washing over me as if it was like wallpaper. And so in a sense, I didn't feel I was told anything, as I say, that I wouldn't have kind of assumed or surmised about the black experience of World War II. There were even moments like they were in a sort of makeshift tent or dormitory, and you have a Hindu family, and then there's a black family, and then you've got our character George brought in by the black military policeman, and then you've got a white family who's basically being racist and pulling down all the sheets and saying, this is our section, you stay where you are. And then the military policeman gives this speech which should have been rousing and had all the kind of right kind of messaging. It was all really, really good messaging. But the messaging about we're all together in this and we should all be united and this is what Germany's trying to do to us and all this kind of, it felt so, for me, it was like, it was risible is too bad a word because the intentions were good. But it was really, it felt like sixth form political debate. And I felt the film sort of lost out because of that. I always remember, is it Bob Iger, the head of Disney, said something along the lines of, when you make a film, you want the messaging to be the subplot. You don't want it to be the main plot. And there were many times in this film where I found, like in this scene, where the messaging, which should have been the subtext, was actually the text, was actually the main plot. You want to bury the other stuff so it's there to be found, not make it the actual subject of the film. So the narrative beat points were predictable, Finally, George gets back. He gets back to the rubble. There's dead Paul Weller. He's in a jam. The cat that's brought out by the fireman is their cat. That's kind of convenient, isn't it? Saoirse, with a scratch across her head, stumbles out and finds her son. It's on the one hand, it's trying to show us something new about a sort of stereotypical romanticized vision of war, and certainly World War II. And yet at the same time, it signs up to the very same almost chocolate box, cliched, romantic notion of what sort of daring do and the Blitz spirit was all about. And as I say, in the middle of it, you have this really, and there was this one particularly grisly scene that again pivoted around Stephen Graham and Kathy Burke's character, where this bar that was obviously playing jazz and had all these posh patrons, and it was happening whilst there was a blackout and it got bombed, and so you cut to this scene of debris where there's all these dead rich people basically in this sort of ballroom, and then they're crawling around the dead bodies, cutting fingers off, taking rings off, sitting with the dead lord at a table and sort of holding his head up. It was so grisly, and in a weird way, those moments spoke to the film that perhaps could have been made, which would have been a film a little bit more like 12 Years a Slave, a little bit more like Hunger, you know, the sort of IRA film, the Irish film, his first film, with Fassbender. And I felt, oh, hang on, there is a film here of the deep, dark underbelly of World War II and the Blitz and evacuations and all that. And it just kept sort of, there was a tug of war between tweeness and just really grisly kind of, well, certainly not really throughout, actually, only in that one scene. But that one scene sort of stood out as, my God, we're propping up dead people. You know, we're playing with dead bodies and putting them in certain positions and chopping bits off them. And there's this boy going through this. It was really quite disturbing in quite an effective way. There are other weird moments in the film, like the scene with Lee Gill, who played the wonderful kind of colleague of the Joker in Joker 2. Anyway, Lee Gill, he plays this odd kind of socialist leader who's running like what feels like a hospital underground in the tunnels or beneath a building, and again they set him up, and it was a big sort of setup, and then he disappeared, and that was a bit strange. But one of the things that I was left coming out of this really thinking was, as you saw the shots of devastation and the shots of total kind of, you know, razed to the ground flattening, here's the Blitz that's considered to be one of the darkest moments in the history of Britain. As I say, up to 43,000 civilians were killed, and right now we have the same, if not worse, having happened and happening in Gaza and now happening in Lebanon, in which at least 43,000 civilians have died. In the Blitz, it was 43,000. It's that sort of odd thing about history. When you go back to like the Great Fire of London, you find out, I mean, obviously any death is regrettable, but there were about 6 deaths or something, and you think, oh my God, for something that's so big in the history books, the actual body count was very low. And that's not to say it was low with the Blitz, but for the emphasis we give it, the fact that still thousands and millions of people and governments of the West still can't get on board with or refuse to even acknowledge that the Blitz that has happened in Palestine, in Gaza, is on a level way beyond what we watch in this film. And I couldn't help but feel all the way through this that yes, it was awful what we went through, but my God, even this, a huge moment in British history, is nowhere near as bad as what we are supporting, tacitly supporting and appeasing in what Israel is doing in Gaza. So it is a film that I don't think intentionally draws that parallel at all, but one couldn't help but feel, when you see this sort of debris and footage and devastation, we are seeing it live streamed now, and so it spoke very much to that. Being generous to the film, I'd say it was trying to find the horror in the everyday of World War II. Being favourable to the film, I think it was trying to give us insights into a very different experience of World War II. But even in its presentation of the experiences of a young black boy, I just found it very predictable, very twee, overly romantic, overly saccharine, and I think fundamentally, at its core, badly written. And every scene was covered incredibly competently, but it lacked the visual flair for me. There were moments, you'd get little moments where you'd see like there'd be an establishing shot. An establishing shot is when you go to a new scene, and more often than not, conventionally, you'll get a wide of where you're going to, don't you, a building or wherever, and then you move into the action. You know, there was one scene where we arrived at a new scene, and it was a close-up of a feather stuck out of a sort of random, a rogue feather stuck out of a pillow, you know, like you get when you go to bed and it sort of hurts you. That was nice, and I could have done with more of that. I felt it could have gone more poetic. I felt it could have gone more artistic. I think it's a film that was in dire need of a video artist, which he is, letting rip a bit more, because it was, you know, it would have been a really nice sort of counterpoint to the very predictable storytelling. And Saoirse Ronan, I mean, she's good, but it's a serviceable performance because the script let her down. She had nowhere really to go. Of course she was worried about her George, but that was about it. And once you've established she's worried about her George, you can't go many other places than that. So what would I score this film by one of our greatest living film directors? I'm afraid I'd give this 48 out of 100.